On behalf of FES India and Pragnya, I welcome you to the fourth session of this webinar series on gender in the changing world of work. And I had just finished saying to Ravi that we would not have thought of doing this if it had not been for Damayanti and Jyoti from FES suggesting that we do something together, and then we brainstormed and we came up with this. So thank you for that. And now that we see your face, let me hand the mic, the metaphorical mic over to you for a couple of seconds before then introducing the facilitator for this session.
Thank you, Swarna, and welcome to all the people who have joined for this webinar. Unfortunately, I'm in a place where I don't have very good internet connection, so I have to use my phone and my 4G. Hope it stays like that, and it works well. And once again, a very warm welcome to all the panelists and all the participants. And of course, Swarna and Prajna, we've worked earlier also together, and it's always a pleasure. Unfortunately, these are not the best of times to be doing things, but I think still we have managed to put together something which is actually very, very relevant in these tough times. And the previous webinars which we had also, we had some very good discussions. Even though Swarna missed me, I think you missed my face. I was very much there.
No, I saw that you were there. Yeah. It's nice to see your face.
Yeah. And I think all the issues which were picked up, be it on migration, be it on precarity of work or care work, they are so relevant at this point of time. And so also the topic for today's webinar. And as some of you know, FES is one of the organizations which has a focus on basically on values of social democracy and gender justice. And from there, we take the values, the work which we do for solidarity in work. And that includes the gender dimension of it, which we try to highlight time and again. It's not the easiest of things to do, especially when we talk about the nature of work, especially in the informal sector. But at least we do try to highlight it at all forums and opportunities that we get. And I think at this point of time, I will not say much more. I'm actually looking forward to hearing the panelists and see how this webinar goes. Thank you, Swarna and Prajna, again for this wonderful collaboration.
Thank you, FES. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's facilitator, Dr. Anand Philip, who invited this elaborate introduction by sending me a one-line bio, which first I will dutifully read out. Anand Philip is a general practitioner and specialist in health technology. It seems woefully inadequate to describe somebody who I know to be a man for all seasons. Somebody I got to know first on Twitter, and therefore I know that he writes well and wittily on a wide range of subjects. He reads. He's a tech wizard, having tried to teach me WordPress over Skype, over a very painful Skype session for me, I think, and for him. And over the years, I have known him to dabble in a range of completely different areas, from literature to actual, surprisingly, clinical practice of medicine, to discussions about sexuality and gender. So when we started to put this panel together, to my mind, there was nobody who could bring a breadth of experience and thinking, as well as having seen a cross-section of the world through his clinical work. I couldn't think of anyone better than Dr. Anand Philip. And on that note, I will hand this session over to him and thank all of you for registering. Some of you have come for all the sessions. Thank you so much for being here. And the panelists, I can't believe you accepted our invitation. I am extremely grateful to you. I think we have an excellent panel, so let's enjoy.
Thank you so much, Swarna, for that introduction and for the reading the bio also. uh, we have a really interesting discussion scheduled today, and we have some really interesting panelists and some very interesting topics and presentations scheduled for all of you. And I hope this is a really nice experience. This webinar is a part of a series of webinars. I think most of you would know that, which Prajna and FES are conducting, which considering various aspects of gender and work in our contemporary milieu, taking into account in particular how COVID-19 has impacted an ecosystem that was already in flux. By interrogating four key facets of modern work: precarity, the relationship between productive and reproductive work, migration, and masculinities, this series will bring out the gendered consequences of the changing nature of work across multiple spatial dimensions. The webinar today will focus on the questions around masculinities and economic uncertainties and try to broadly answer the following questions. When patriarchal norms tell you that it is your job to provide for the family and economic downturns make that impossible, how does that affect men's sense of identity? What kind of feelings do these internal conflicts lead to? And what impact might they have on others, for example, in terms of violence against women? How have the various forms of hegemonic masculinities, as described by R.W. Connell, been impacted by the pandemic and its attendant uncertainties? So that's sort of to set the background. I'm going to quickly tell you the order of the program. We will begin with short presentations on the three core issues around this topic of about 10 minutes each. Then we will try to address the aforementioned questions and others in detail and have a short discussion around the things that our panelists speak about. And once we've tied up that conversation, we'll open the floor for discussion. And I will introduce the panelists and their topics as they begin. I hope that's okay with everyone. We begin with Anand Pawar.
Yeah.
Okay. So our first speaker is Anand Pawar. Anand Pawar is Executive Director of SAMYAK, an NGO based in Pune. He is a male gender trainer and activist involved with women's and men's groups working towards gender justice and violence-free society. He was also an active member of the South Asian Network to Address Masculinities and one of the Asia board members of Women's Peacemaker Program, Netherlands. He's traveled extensively internationally. He has served as a consultant to many NGOs and developmental agencies, including UN agencies. Development of communication material on gender, men, and masculinities is a specific area of interest. He is involved in conceptualizing and contextualizing training and programs on gender and masculinities over the past 2 decades. He plays a key role in engaging with social justice movements to locate issues of men and masculinities in their activisms. He's also associated with various qualitative research initiatives exploring issues around gender, men, and masculinities in South Asia. He teaches a modular course on men, masculinities, and sexual and reproductive health with JP Grant School of Public Health, Brak University, Bangladesh. In his presentation, he will mainly focus on the way politics of masculinity emerge and get sanctioned socioculturally based on the kind of work men do in rural parts of India and urban poor communities. He will further elaborate on intersectionality lens to comment on who lost their jobs and how it has impacted gender and power relations in communities impacting women, children, and men themselves. We will also bring in the observed and reported triggers of domestic violence in this economic distress. Over to you, Anand.
Thank you, Anand, for this introduction and also outlining the broad ideas that I'm going to really engage with. I really congratulate the organizers for organizing something like this around employment and unemployment. Because masculinities as the term is being really used by various sectors and various agencies in a different in its different meanings. For instance, I would say that development agencies have used in a very different sense, and INGOs have used the concept of masculinity in a different sense, and a lot of scholarships around masculinities has used it in a different sense, and peace and conflict kind of work has interpreted masculinities in a different sense, and at the same time the sexual rights movements have interpreted masculinities in a different sense. As we see that masculinities has become the kind of very important discourse in last a decade and a half or maybe two, masculinities in a way. I want to make the first statement that for many years, almost till the last decade, till 2007 or so, or broadly in South Asia and across the world, working with men and boys was equated with working on masculinities. So masculinities was connected only with men and boys, and not as an idea that has been constructed by market and by say economies and globalization and cultures and histories, and so all these arenas impact the ideas of manhood in a given society or given cultures. And because this was not at the center of the discourses, the discourse of employment and unemployment was missing from the so-called masculinities work. And I would say that most of that was around initially about sexual health, and then about reproductive health, and then about HIV/AIDS, and then about gender-based violence, and then about parenthood and responsible fathers. But rather, I would say that this is my reflection, basically saying that considering all the men as a homolytic category, and masculinity also is a homolytic understanding, until a lot of focus actually put back on the work around Connell's, R.W. Connell's work, where he started when it was started reinforcing about the hegemonic aspect of masculinity and subordination, and all different forms of masculinity. So congratulations for the organizers for bringing the employment and unemployment and economic crisis as the vehicle to discuss around masculinities at this particular point of time. I also would say that similarly, employment and unemployment was also considered as the job kind of arena, or say industrial or market kind of discourse, and not was considered as the discourse that must be impacting gender power relations and gender justice in our society. So it's a very interesting panel which will bring in all different kind of perceptions in this panel discussion. I would like to share a story where we started under the guidance of Dr. Sharmila Rege, one of the sociologists, and who was with Pune University. And we were doing, as SAMYAK, we were doing a study around, in Marathi, it was called Nuste Baslele Purush. In Hindi, which means Khali Baithe Hue Mard. And in English, it means the men who are not doing anything. So we were like going through these 20 case stories around men who are not doing anything. And she actually then, in a way, late Dr. Sharmila Rege helped us to conceptualize in a different way, saying then when you say that men who are not doing anything, you are expecting them to do the economic work. And that exactly is the burden that they are carrying. So, the story goes like this, wherein one of the man in our office is based right in urban slum of Pune. And I used to see this man every day, and he would just wave his hand and say, hello, namaskar, while I walk to my office in the community. Now, one day I just thought that let me sit with him and talk to him and ask him, exactly at 9:30 in the morning. What is he doing every day out there? And then he said that he lost his job. He lost his job not because of the kind of lockdown, but he lost his job much before that, when Dr. Sharmila Rege was around, in a way, I mean, some 6-7 years back. And he was the one who was skilled into selling, preparing and selling the roasted peanuts, that typically are being sold in Maharashtra. And he used to sell it outside a single screen cinema hall, single screen theater in Pune. And as the multiplexes started emerging, he lost his job because the culture of the cinematic kind of intervals then changed from these single window to polypack kind of eating. And he lost his job, and he did this job for 35 years of his life, and he lost his work. Now he was just sitting out there and started interfering with his family and with his wife's lives and with children, etc. So now one need to really see that any kind of rampant change or speedy change impact the employability and employment of especially which men which are marginalized socially and economically, coming from deprived background, and then they don't have other skill sets where they could actually get into some other jobs. And that really helped us understand that this is something that need to really be thought of when we talk about masculinities and employment and unemployment and the way people lose their jobs in the rapidly changing these economies. Now, further to aggravate, if we see that so because we are in because we really see that there are power relations amongst masculinities, and it is not just caste-based hierarchies amongst men. Men are not homolytic group as we understand. So it is not just about caste and class of men, but it is also type of job they do in rural parts of India and in urban slums. It is also part of job they do. The power relations amongst masculinities are being defined by the kind of job that you do. And that is why we see in urban areas that those who are working in ITs and say so-called white-collar jobs have more access and opportunities for accessing, say, facilities and say kind of lifestyle. Whereas people who are working in our slums are plumbers, and they are auto rickshaw drivers, and they are like carpenters, and they are taxi drivers, and they are vada pav walas, and they are like welders, and they are like street hawkers, and they are like scrap collectors, and etc. So if you see the kind of impact of this economic crisis after the lockdown was very heavily seen on all these people who are in a way are in a kind of unorganized sector and informal sector. And all those men who have lost job have what we record at the moment is that all those who have lost their jobs and who have lost their small businesses and their street hawkers kind of jobs and work, etc., they were completely in a kind of miserable situation than certainly than the IT people, than say professors, and then say in a way development sector employees, because their salaries didn't continue during the lockdown. So what we saw is basically impact on a very different level. Another scene that I see is that lot many of the street hawkers in Pune are disabled men. We tried to get the data from the disability commissionerate here in Pune. We didn't really get in time. Otherwise, I would have really quoted or shared the data. A number of people who are disabled, men who are in street hawker, they are street hawkers, and most of them couldn't really move out, and that really impacted their economic lives. Now, when we see that, when we see that how it must have impacted their domestic relations with their wives and children, So I just feel that I need to really many people have reported there was a consortium of civil society organizations who reported about the kind of triggers that relate to domestic violence, and three of documented triggers were like presence of perpetrators 24/7 in the home. Now, this was compiled by Breakthrough, and but presence of the perpetrators all the time in home without really being able to go out. Now, now the space home need to be really seen from the intersectional perspective. Space of what size, and space of whom, and space of which space. A huge bungalow in Mumbai, or a three-bedroom flat in Pune must have been different experiences, wherein the community where we work in, and we were constantly engaged with supporting them with grocery packets and etc. And we saw that while we were distributing grocery packets, the kind of anguish and the kind of frustration that men used to really take on their women. Men really didn't really came to collect the grocery packets, but they pushed their women to collect the grocery packets, because seeking help itself is considered as a non-masculine kind of domain. Madad mangna is a problematic idea for many of the men. So they didn't really approach for grocery, but they pushed their women. And if she didn't really get that, because we used to have limited number of packets per day, and if she didn't really give that, we have these reported cases of he beating his wife. And what I feel is that not just sharing a small 10x10 kind of tin shade as a family, it must be more torturous for women to even stay continuously with the batterer, rather than the batterer confined to a limited space. So I think that it has impacted both men and women and children. Loss of jobs and income perpetrators, leading to inability to support economic needs of the family. Well, I think that is quite a kind of theorization, but it is one really need to really understand that lack of because in urban slums specifically, most of the men are actually not working. They were not really working. Their wives were working. They were like domestic help. They were like domestic maids in say neighboring middle class and upper middle class housing societies. So most of them who were not really working and alcoholic were also then observed to be taken the perceived role of the breadwinner. In fact, they were not working, and they started abusing their wives because they lost their jobs as housemaids, because cooperative societies banned completely women entering into the society. So they lost their jobs. So men committed violence not just because they lost their jobs, they also committed violence because their wives lost their jobs. And that's why I see that, which men, and, we need to really bring in that kind of perspective here. And of course, poverty, education, the new demands of technology for the children's education, because it's going online. And I guess, some of these issues need to be really seen as the impact of the economic crisis. The last point that I want to share is an anecdotal story again. Due to the loss of job, a man due to the loss of the job, there was these cases around domestic violence, and a case was registered to us, to SAMYAK, and where wife applied for divorce because he lost his job, and she continued with her job. So both were earning, and now it has impacted men. It also has impacted women, and it also has impacted their children also. What I feel is that when we talk about employability, unemployability, specifically in the economic crisis like this and a kind of a health crisis like this, we might have to really bring in a lot many other dimensions also, and not just to think it from very rigid perspectives around masculinities and feminities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anand. I think that was a lovely note, and I think the idea that men's identities are very closely linked to their work, I think is a really powerful idea and a really important concept to sort of always keep in mind when we are doing when we talk about masculinities. We will move to our second presentation, which is by Ravi Verma. I will read the bio and talk about the talk. Ravi Verma is a social scientist and demographer researching and working on issues of gender equality and men and masculinities for the last 2 decades. He is currently working with the International Center for Research on Women, New Delhi, and oversees the research programs to empower adolescent girls. In his overview, he will talk about the ways by which the masculinity norms have found the current pandemic to exacerbate pre-existing inequalities to the advantages of those who were already privileged. This has witnessed masculinization of spaces, especially rural areas, violence against women and girls, and marginalization of women from livelihood and resources. At the same time, the pandemic has also exposed the vulnerabilities of men who are deeply entrenched into these rigid masculine norms and expectations. This is evident by the elevated rates of death and suicides among men. In this context of pandemic-related unemployment, pandemic-related unemployment could be a major area of concern. Over to you, Ravi.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Philip. Thanks, Prajna, for having me here. It's a pleasure to be talking among our friends on the issue that we so much care for. And thanks, Anand Pawar, for providing the lead into the concept of gender and masculinity by saying that it is not equivalent to men. It is a fluid, ever-changing, contextual, and kind of a contested concept. Gender is a contested concept, and therefore what we see around us is a reflection of how some of these expectations play out within this power dynamics of those who are those who are privileged have a sense of entitlement versus those who are not or who are less privileged, and then these things keep changing and keep evolving. And this pandemic, as Anand Philip said, is something which has aggravated these dynamics of power equations and who is gaining more space than the other, given the fact that everyone feels so insecure and unsafe. So one is exercising everything that one is there, that one has in terms of the toolbox. So what I did was just looked at some of the evidence in last few months, these months of pandemic, to see what is the literature emerging on the issue of men and masculinities in relation to work, in relation to violence against women, in relation to other issues like mental health and suicides, and was trying to just get my own picture clear in my own head as to what are we seeing around, what does evidence suggest. The literature, there's been a lot of publications, but I think good publications to rely on pattern is difficult, because there is also rush to publish at this point in time. People are generalizing a lot more than what perhaps is called for, or people we need to wait and watch how things evolve. Issues are complex out there. And in that, to find good literature to see, and from our own insights of work that we are doing in the field, has been a kind of exercise that I did with my colleagues while preparing for my my storyline for this particular webinar. So if you see Ashwini Deshpande's work, which I think is the paper does show very through a rigorous analysis that overall employment has dropped sharply post-lockdown. And this drop in employment is not gender neutral, as we all know. So what has happened is that given the large pre-existing gender gaps in employment, in absolute terms, more men have lost employment than women. But what is important is that conditional on being employed pre-lockdown, women were roughly about 20 percentage point less likely to have been re-employed than men who were employed pre-lockdown. So keep that perspective in mind in terms of work, employment and re-employment, unemployment and re-employment. And if you look at the hours spent on domestic work pre and post lockdown, men have increased hours of time spent on domestic work during lockdown. But then this proportion of doing about half an hour to 4 hours work of housework that the Ashwini Deshpande analyzes, their colleague, has increased post-lockdown work. But this seems to be driven by the fact that a lot of men were unemployed, but the work is very gendered. Work distribution is very gendered. What kind of work men do and what women do during this time has been extremely gendered, when men still doing a lot of work which requires outside or rather than helping in the care work. And the time spent with friends have decreased for both men and women, but relatively much more for women. So we must remember that. What is interesting, okay, so this is one piece on work related. The studies on linking, ideas of masculinities with violence against women have been very revealing. So one of the studies shows that links, in the this study used difference in difference analysis to show that there has been almost 131% increase in domestic violence complaints in May 2020 in districts that saw the strictest lockdown measures. This is NCW complaints, National Commission of Women recorded these complaints. And these are the red zone districts. So red zone districts have experienced almost 184% increase in cybercrime complaint as well, compared to the green zone, which is data is from May 2020 and June 2020. So what does this imply? Does it imply that stricter lockdown led to more violence? Yes. Thus, in places where mobility was restricted, men were present at home for longer and violence occurred. So that's one. But then if you layer this analysis by another dimension, and that is men's attitude to women, then it presents, that really brings out the issue of what we have been discussing. And this is a very interesting analysis that this group did using NFHS4 data, which shows that district in which a greater proportion of husbands reported that beating wives is justified, that those districts witnessed much greater increase in domestic violence complaint received by NCW compared to the districts where this was not so. So what does it show is that lockdowns or these difficult times for men when they were unemployed, they intersected with this attitude of what men thought of women, their sense of control and entitlement, and the fact that they felt more powerful by controlling women and using violence as a means, were the places and were the men where we witnessed much increased violence. So it was not kind of a blanket rise in violence, but it intersected with this dimension of attitude. So, and that's important to remember, how masculinity ideas or expectations do begin to play an important role in this. So what we have seen is that as per the prevailing patriarchal norm, men are expected to earn, they are the breadwinners. So thus in the economic impact of COVID in terms of loss of job, loss of savings, has led to increased sense of insecurity from their inability to provide. So that's something which comes out clearly. Our work in Jharkhand, we are working in rural areas, and we see that husband and wife, we have seen increased violence within the homes, and husband and wife are fighting more often, leading to verbal, emotional, and physical violence. And one thing which we hear very often in our qualitative work is that men get very angry if their wives point out anything lacking. That is, if the wife says that some grocery items are running out, that is a trigger that men lash out at them. I think, see, the whole idea of that existing hopelessness and anxieties in men, and they take it personally, that it is pointing to their flaws, that they are not able to provide, becomes the trigger for violence. And many women said in our interviews that, men get angry if you tell them that there is something, these grocery items are not there. So women also begin to perform emotional labor, and they are trying to mitigate the impact of men's inability to process their emotions, and that is important. But we must be careful not to equate or oversimplify that COVID is equivalent to economic distress, equivalent to masculinity and violence. Violence was happening elsewhere. It also happened before COVID. Among upper class, within homes, in private spaces. It went unreported. So domestic violence was always happening, and it is not it was not a shadow kind of pandemic. It has just been aggravated, much like many other forms of discrimination and violence during COVID time. And I think men and masculinity ideas have been a kind of defining parameters in that. So underlying social and gender norms and conditions for violence have always existed, that we must remember. And COVID-19 is only an aggravating factor. Linking them should not mean that it did not happen before COVID and will stop happening once we change the situation. So I think that's an important thing to remember. The other aspect that has been missed out on, or we have heard a lot about during this time, is mental health aspect of men. Specifically in relation to economic distress and masculinity. These are much less talked about, in fact. What is the pathways through which violence happens? So, and this is despite the fact that mental health has become a buzzword during this time. So, it's important to know that given that everything has changed around them, how do men perceive their sense of identity, their role? Is mental health linked to violence, and how does what goes in that space between the experience of insecurity and stress and the perpetration of violence against intimate partners. And we know that actually it is all about how men have been socialized to handle stress, emotions, and fears. It bottle them to express only through aggression, violence. There is still stigma around admitting inability to meet familial or societal expectations, and often these things result in suicide and other harmful behaviors, substance abuse, or violence against others and partners. So even when money is low. So I think one of the we don't have very strong data on suicide by gender disaggregated data on that, but yes, the data that is emerging shows that many more men are committing suicides than women, and a lot of that is also connected to this whole fact of stress that they go through by not fulfilling their expected roles. So it's and I think this is something which is kind of across both men and women. My sense is that it's not about men versus women. We are talking about an entire social and economic ecosystem which is founded in patriarchy, which is founded in this kind of exploitation, and it puts pressure from all sides. And therefore, and as a society, we are not equipping men, in fact, to deal with these spaces and tools to address some of the stresses. We have also seen in this time an increased literature on how men are less likely to wear masks, or they are more likely to take risk in terms of um, not maintaining social distances and all that. So these are well documented discourses around the harms of masculinity we have seen in recent times, and these are important points to discuss and perhaps take further. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to take it further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ravi. That was a lovely summary and sort of a review of the research that is emerging on this issue, and a reminder how the pre-existing issues around masculinities and the way men deal with emotions and deal with stressful situations is interacting with the extremely stressful and situation we are in now, and the employment aspects of it as well. So we will now move on to our third presenter. L. Ramakrishnan. L. Ramakrishnan is a public health professional associated with Solidarity and Action Against the HIV Infection in India, SAATHII. He works towards inclusive access to healthcare, justice, and social protection for communities marginalized on account of gender, sexuality, and/or HIV status. He will speak about how traditional gender norms and cis heteropatriarchal roles enforced by natal families have further compounded the lockdown-associated impacts faced by lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex, and other queer communities who are already facing acute socioeconomic marginalization. Over to you, Ramakrishnan.
Thank you very much, Anand, and the other Anand, Ravi, Prajna, and other colleagues at Prajna who put this together. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about non-hegemonic masculinities, if I may, particularly, gay, lesbian, the LGBT community, but with a focus on gay and bisexual and non-binary people assigned male at birth, as well as trans men or trans masculine people who embrace masculinity despite being assigned female at birth. And this is going to be drawing on some of the crisis support calls that we've been getting in the NGO SAATHII that I work with, and in various queer collectives across the country. Some of the individual and group peer support happening around the country, of which I'm also among the facilitators. Some of the referral calls we've been getting for short stay for people from the LGBT community who've been facing violence from their natal families, and in a few cases engaging with family members and intimate partners. So I think it was in April where my colleagues at SAATHII and I organized a webinar on mental health and issues facing the LGBTIQ community. And one of the participants was a trans woman from Eastern India who worked as a sex worker, but owing to the lockdown, was forced to return to her natal family. And she was saying, on one hand, this was good because a lot of the men who were her regular clients in sex work and who were, abusive, physically abusive and sexually abusive to her are now no longer in the picture, and they don't know where she's disappeared. But on the other hand, she's facing violence at home from her father, who is trying to force her to wear male clothes, to stop taking the estrogen that she was taking as part of her hormone therapy, and preventing her from wearing the makeup that she uses as part of affirming her trans feminine identity. So this, in a sense, illustrates the complexity of issues for people who have anyway been facing stigma and discrimination because of their gender identity, gender expression, and or sexual orientation. And the problems associated with living in the natal family that a lot of the community members had tried to escape from and are now being forced to return to. So again, I'll speak primarily about queer men, gay, bisexual, and other people assigned male at birth, but who may be non-binary. And I'll also speak about trans men, who are people assigned female at birth. Across the board, we've seen people who have left homes, who migrated often to cities in search of work, many of whom are working in the service sector, who are working doing daily wages or in sex work, have been forced to return to natal families. They've been unable to pay rent at the places where they've been staying. And in some cases, they've also been sexually harassed by their landlords for not being able to pay the rent and been asked to give sex instead of the rent because they can't pay the rent. And at home, many of them did leave home without actually being able to come out or speak about their sexuality or gender to their parents. In some cases, they have spoken about it and have been forced to leave home because of the ensuing violence. So what we've seen is at natal homes, with fathers also not going to work and perhaps other siblings also being at home, we have been hearing a lot of instances where the natal families have been trying to quote unquote convert these folks into more mainstream gender identities and sexual orientations. In many cases, they have used the opportunity of lockdown to actually arrange marriages with people of the other gender, heterosexual marriages. And so these are some of the big issues. We've seen homophobic attempts by family members to make their children cut off from peers of their own gender identity or sexuality, or in some cases break up with their romantic partners. We've seen transphobic attempts by adult family members, like I described, to get adult children to detransition. So, for example, trans men have been forced to stop testosterone therapy, to wear conventionally feminine clothes, and vice versa, of course, for trans women who've been asked to, forced to express their gender as men, as assigned male and as men. We've also seen issues of incidents of curative rape and attempted rape of lesbian, bisexual women and trans women by cis male family members, including fathers and brothers. So a lot of this has been the impact of economic distress, having been forced to return home to their families, and in a sense being out, coming out to family members as someone who's gay, lesbian, or non-gender, non-conforming, or transgender itself, especially for those assigned male, is seen as a failure of masculinity because they are less than men, because they are quote unquote like women. But at least they had the economic independence, or those that did have the economic independence and are being forced to return home are seen as, having further failed masculinity by not only being queer or trans, but also not bringing in an income. And because of a lot of systemic violence in educational institutions, queer and trans people, especially those who are visibly gender non-conforming, had also been forced to drop out of school and not be able to enter the formal education sector. So they're very much reliant on working in salons, working in malls, or doing sex work or other, sort of daily wage. So there's been that kind of perceived fall in failure of their masculinity, which was already considered to have failed because of their not being heterosexual and cis and performing masculinity. So these are some of the experiences that we have observed during the lockdown, and perhaps we can discuss this more during the Q&A. Thank you. Anand, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ramakrishnan. That was a really a grim reminder of how being marginalized sort of interacts with the pandemic situation, and how intense and focused the violence faced by such communities, in particular the communities mentioned by Ramakrishnan, are. I hope we can come back to some of these issues in the discussions that we have now, and I hope all the panelists are unmuted. Okay, so as an overview, what we what we've heard so far is how masculinities as an idea itself is not a very it's not something that you can equate with being male. It's closely linked, and how male and masculine identities are linked with work, how economic distress sort of exacerbates the underlying social tensions, and the pre-existing and how the social beliefs that are already existing and practices that are already existing with regards to the normalization of violence against women, the normalization of heteronormativity, and things like that, how they interact with this sort of an economic stress. And we've also seen how this in particular affects people from the lesbian, gay, bi, and trans communities, and those with yeah. So now we can maybe specifically, sort of talk about, and any of you can start, sort of take this up about, how is this? So we are clearly seeing that men are. Sorry, what is that? Okay, right. So the question being, we are seeing that patriarchal norms on one side say that it's sort of a man's responsibility to provide for the family, and the economic downturn and the lockdown sort of makes that impossible. How is this overall affecting men's sense of identity? Over to the panelists.
Well, I guess very interesting. Basically, the way identities are being constructed are multifaceted. In that sense, when we use the word identity, the identities are being constructed psycho-emotionally, culturally, in different sense. So one of the expectation that gender socialization, in a way, teaches men to be bread earners, and I guess that identity of a man by the gender socialization and expectation that he should be earning, I guess itself is it shapes the ideas around his own manhood. Besides that, what I feel is that the internal aspirations, desires of what kind of provider you want to be, also contribute to the identity of manhood. So it is not just an external expectation from society and family to be a provider, but men deciding internally what kind of provider you want to be. You want to be a kind of a very average provider. You want to be a kind of performing provider. You want to be a kind of provider who is actually not provider, but would portray himself as a provider. What I feel is that all of that really does matter, and identities are not just constructed socially and culturally. What I feel is that identities are also constructed as bread earner internally also, psycho-emotionally also. So I might not really feel that I should be providing kind of a high-tech kind of foreign education to my kid, and I'm happy being a father. But someone might really have this kind of dreams. It also are being impacted by class. So a very simple expectation of a auto rickshaw driver in my community is that to have a smartphone with a 4G connection so that his child can attend his online classes, and by providing that technology, he becomes a proud father. But that's his simple expectation because he's having, non-smart kind of, so-called non-smart kind of telephone with him. And he was like, he really spoke to me where I park. And then he said that, which is the SIM card that provides the best connectivity in our slum? And then I was telling that, falana, whatever. So, what I feel is that a sense of manhood is not just socially and culturally constructed. It will be it will be changing, in a sense, by caste and class and region and location, even the location. So if someone is in a remote village, the sense of being provider man is going to be completely different than the sense of being provider in, say, any other urban slums or whatever. I mean, so I guess, so it is complex, I guess, but let us not just feel that, it is just a kind of externally constructed idea. It is also desires, and those desires also could be created externally, of course. For instance, market has created this desire to provide the kid with the higher technology. The kind of education system has created this need for that father to be a father, a providing man. With the way lockdown education has started. So there are multiple facets to the idea of identity of a man as in a role of provider. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Would Dr. Ravi or Ramakrishnan, would you like to take this up?
Ramki, you want to go?
Go ahead.
Well, I think that I didn't, looking at this issue of masculinities from identity perspective is somewhat discomforting to me. I don't bring the language of identity while discussing the issue of masculinities, because I think that's reductionist in some ways. My sense is that what's happening in crisis or in situations where men, or for that matter anyone who feels that if there are expectations that one is not able to meet, and how excessive the pressure is to meet that expectation, is what creates a pathway of stresses and different coping strategies or responses. And those coping or the mitigating responses could also be determined by what kind of tools that a person has to deal with, or thinks that what are the expected ways of dealing with those situations. So it's kind of a web of expectations around an individual, and it so happens that in a patriarchal societies, men seem to take their position for granted. The entitlement is kind of entrenched, and therefore if there are situation of crisis and challenges, they begin to find ways to reassert themselves in some ways, or resign themselves completely and get into depressions and mental health issues. You see, we have seen a lot of and that's what I was saying in those findings, that wherever men held very rigid views about women, were more likely to commit violence, even in situations where there were lockdowns and the crisis, much more than those who are others. I think that's an important nuanced finding that shows that it is what you expect that people think of you, what you expect others expect of you is important, and it gets intersected with the class and caste and the gender in a very convoluted manner. So those who have their own already positions and power defined, and if they are challenged, then they begin to either respond in a very aggressive manner to others, or they become self-inflicting. They begin to inflict pains onto themselves. So every individual then begins to follow a slightly different trajectory of dealing with these situations, and that's what interesting is to study and see who responds in what ways, in what kind of context. Even the men we thought that if they were powerful, they're not powerful in every situation, and they begin to respond in ways which are a response of a very powerless person. So yes, I would go beyond just defining and identity-based kind of a discussion to this kind of a contested space of power and dynamics of relations. That's very important.
Okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. And Ramki?
Yeah, I was thinking about the conflicts between the gender identity that one embraces and the gender identity that people want you to embrace or often thrust upon you. And what this lockdown has brought into focus is, for example, with gay and bisexual men who have tried hard to assert a masculine identity which is independent of heterosexuality, whereas the heterosexuality is an integral part of masculinity for their natal family, trying to assert their masculinity when the family is saying, don't be like a girl or don't be feminine and go get married and make us proud. Or, on the other hand, a trans masculine person who within the family is seen as a girl because of being assigned female at birth and being consistently told at home that you have to behave like a girl, and the frustration that many of these trans men have felt. Again, trans men also internalize notions of masculinity from society at large, where they are the powerful ones or they are the breadwinners in their family. So you have trans men who are in relationships with cis women, and they see themselves in the role of the man, and having been separated from their partner, from their female partners, and being forced to stay with their family, with their birth family, and seeing their girlfriends being forced to get married, and they themselves not being able to do anything about it, not being able to go and assert their love for their partner and bring her back. This causes a lot of conflict, I would say, in terms of their own sense of being a man, being in this particular case, a trans man. So I see this conflict between the gender, which is sort of hard won and embraced by oneself, which often takes years and years to develop, being so quickly and efficiently demolished by the gender expectations that the family around you have and are using the opportunity of the lockdown to impose on you.
Well, that's really powerful. So I think from what I sort of understood from what all of you are saying is that in different sort of contexts, people's identities are definitely being questioned or being challenged by the environment, but also about the internal expectations that we have of ourselves and from other people, and also that it sort of extends beyond identities to sort of a web of expectations, as the phrase was mentioned, but also about sort of the sort of social structures and beliefs that exist sort of outside these identities, and the interactions of all of these is being seen. Okay, so I have a question related to how men talk about their identities, but maybe we'll come to that later. The next question that we sort of decided to discuss was how are these feelings that are being produced by the conflict that everybody is facing, men, women, how is this impacting the people around men? So we got a very clear sort of, we had sort of, this was something that all of you talked about, and specifically Ramki and Anand mentioned how this is leading to specific types of violences. But, is there anything additional or more that you would like to talk about the impact of this internal external conflict and the surrounding their contexts on other people?
Well, I can quickly reflect on this point.
Yes.
You have anyone in mind to respond to this, or is it okay if I could just think loud on this?
No, I think all of us can. Yeah, all of us can, and yeah.
Okay, so Okay, so what was the question? The question is that how it is impacting lots of other aspects of men's lives and people around them, given this kind of conflict. Besides some of the things that we spoke about, violence against intimate partners or self-inflicting pains and suicides or things. My sense is that what we are seeing in this short duration is that gender relations are being questioned much more sharply within the spaces of domestic spaces and in personal spaces. This COVID situation has created a kind of a natural experimental lab where uh, people are experiencing these changes within themselves, within with people around them. And I'm saying this. Don't ask me if there is an evidence, because I'm a very evidence conscious person. So when I make statement, I feel as if this needs to be proven. This hypothesis needs to be proven. But I think from what I have seen around our work, that it's a paradoxical situation where uh, men and all those around them have begun to reevaluate their relations within these spaces. So we see in domestic spaces a lot of men, the finding from Ashwini Deshpande's work, and it is corroborated by many others, that a lot of men claim that they have begun to take part in domestic chores, and they are changing their idea of gender equality is taking much greater roots in these families, especially young couples and others. This is something that needs to be seen and studied as to how stable are these changes, what the initial findings or initial results that we see from anecdotal evidence is that a lot of those divisions, participations of men inside household chores are also gendered in many ways, but yet they are perhaps beginning to show a transition. And I think I would be keen to see if these artificial experimental situation that we have landed up in relational context, is it really transformational in some ways. I would really, we have always been seeing, we never had a situation where we were forced to live together, we were forced to really share spaces, and for this such a long period. So men and women both begin to see issues of their own, critical areas of relationship and power dynamics that goes many times unspoken and unspoken, without discussion in our system, in our society especially, which is very well defined. Everybody plays their role, and the day ends. But now, when you're living day in and day out, then you are beginning to question some of your parameters. And I think the potential, in some ways, in some places, this gender must be transforming. Gender relations must be. I'm absolutely sure. Now, who is transforming, in what ways, and why, is the issue that we need to look at. Are masculinities undergoing far more rigid, in the rigid directions, or men are becoming more relaxed and far more inclusive and more questioning to themselves? Is that happening or not? And I think that's happening. I think it's happening because a lot of we see men's discussion in our WhatsApp groups, in social media, the type of discussions that happen, they often baffle me, because I see some of the statements and some of the points made by people whom I never expected are far more egalitarian and accepting and apologetic and inward looking. And I think I want more and more men to see inwards and begin, and that's the journey of transformation, that our area of impact of this masculinity transformation, that if we are talking about, and that's where I would put my money and my research areas to focus on.
Okay. That was lovely. I'm reminded of the survey that Pragya did about the lockdown and experiences. I hope all of you who are in the audience can look at that. Questions in that were sort of relevant to what we just heard. The first question was about how how much do you enjoy being around your family in the given that it's a lockdown situation. And it's a very gendered response in that about in the high 90s women were like, this is great, and in the 70s men were like, yeah, this is nice, so in the sense that around 90% of women said that this is fantastic, and around 70% of men were like, yeah, this is good. And the other was about men sort of, I think for the first time, noticing how much work goes into running a house. And I mean, I really do hope that some of these things lead to transformations. Anand and Ramki, any comments on this?
Yeah, can I come in? I mean, as I always love Ravi making these very interesting points, and as you said, as a kind of the evidence-based person, but I believe that Ravi is not just an evidence-based person; he's also a philosopher and thinker, but who generally do not really, in a way, transmit his ideas unless there is evidence, in that sense. But as a practitioner in communities, I do feel that. I do feel that these kind of transformations are happening, and as a critic, I would rather raise an issue that possibly gender roles might be changing, but whether it is changing the power relations. For instance, in the context of masculinities, in the context of masculinities, I do believe I have these anecdotal stories where men realize the burden of domestic work. My friends sharing stories about how they are managing with the kind of domestic work, and how he has started contributing and realized, these kind of stories. But in a broader sense now, not to really contest what Ravi expressed, but in a broader sense, when I see that, whether we see that the gender power relations in a different are transforming. For instance, when it comes to masculinity, during the lockdown, have we been able to disconnect blue as a connection, masculine connection, and pink as a feminine connection? Have we been able to disconnect KTM or bigger bikes with the notion of mardangi, masculinity, than something, or risk-taking or performance of violence? I would rather say that, we need to really also possibly go beyond very visible change in gender roles to the very innately internalized ideas of power and expression of masculinities. And as a sociologist, I don't know how to capture that kind of change. I don't really understand. But when I see that, when we say that, at a point, we say that, aggravated domestic violence is observed during the lockdown, do we really say that the relations are transforming? On the basis of evidence, we say that there is an aggravation of violence. Of course, not to generalize in a specific community where it was studied, and I understand all of that. But we need to really see that whether it is really transforming or whether it is just showing a kind of shade, and how much of possibility of reversing the trend the moment we get out of lockdown is going to be there. That's my submission. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I think Ramki.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot.
Impact. Yeah, because I think you already sort of very clearly mentioned the. Yeah, please continue.
I was just going to say that this natural experiment will probably end at some point, being optimistic. So we'll actually have to see how much the transformation or expansion of notions of gender roles remains that way versus goes back to what it was before. So yeah, we'll have to wait and watch. Yeah. But we are definitely seeing a lot of assertions of masculinity where, because of not being able to be breadwinners, at the same time consumed by the need to assert masculinity, we're having a lot of sort of authoritarianism seen in the home in addition to the violence. So I'm not sure that this is transformative.
Yeah. So I have a follow-up question. This is to you, Ramki, and then I would like the others also to answer this, which is, so we are seeing some of this sort of identity, self, masculinity, or expressions in violence. We are seeing some of this in the forms of sort of mental anguish and depression and mental health issues. We are seeing this in forms of authoritarianism. So my question to you, Ramki, specifically is that, so now, given the environments they are in, what are the avenues for marginalized men and people with marginalized identities for expressing and exploring their identities? And then I would, like to ask the others about, how does this apply? So, besides hitting people, how else how else do men express these things? But Ramki, so
Yeah.
what are the avenues that are available right now?
Right. So speaking of marginalized masculinities and specifically about the queer community, again, there's a wide heterogeneity, and we've seen that with those who do have access to smartphones and all of that, there's a concerted attempt to sort of keep in touch with other people of the same identity or orientation, where family members do allow it. But there's also lots of cases where the family members have sort of banned them from interacting with their peers. But we are seeing in several cities, at least, a lot of support groups, online support groups have come up, or groups that were formerly offline have now gone online. So there are support spaces, group support spaces. There are also a fair number of hotlines and helplines that have come up where at least people can talk about the issues they face as queer and trans people. And express their gender identity or sexuality in that way. But again, this is very much dependent on them having the privilege and the resources to be able to network in this way.
And I think it I really do wonder in that how this is going to in turn affect the identity questions a lot of them have to deal with on a daily basis anyway. And particularly and specifically for people who are being denied treatment and things like that, or rather estrogen supplements and things like that. That's okay. I think that's something that we will see with time. So to the other panelists, so what are the avenues for expression of, I don't know, this is a very really broad question, but masculinities that are available right now, given that a lot of the traditional things, I mean, a lot of the things that were available before you were kind of at home are no longer present. What are we seeing? So Ravi mentioned WhatsApp group discussions. Maybe you can go tell us a little more.
Okay, there was a little breakdown in your sentence, so I didn't get after what are the avenues. But let me construct, and if I am off the mark completely, stop me.
Sure.
I think. I think if we are not talking about gender masculinity, let me think about it, because we are talking about gender relations. Essentially, we are talking about gender relations, and
Sure.
and these gender relations are changing. If my assumption is right, that this 7-8 months of very different kind of living conditions and work from home, and people coming to terms with the fact that we can work from distance and yet rely and trust each other and do good amount of work. All that has undergone a transformation, in the way we looked at each other, in work relations, in our personal relations, in our neighborhood relations. So my sense is that if these transformatory potentials have to be maximized, and change everyone, men, women, and all, then the avenues need to be around institutions and structures that we work with. So it has to be a much wider framework within which we begin to institutionalize, begin questioning some of these parameters uh, of conventional relational parameters that we had, within the regime of rigid masculinity. We forget that while we are seeing a rigid, much more aggressive and violent forms of masculinity, the other side is that we are also, and I can tell you, if you have data, the problem there is that we don't gather enough information to talk about these issues as to what are the nuances. But the fact is that there are more men are dying than women, from the suicides. There are much, and it was always there even before, but it has aggravated almost. And there have been quite a few good papers, if not in India but outside India, in South, in Bangladesh, in similar societies like us, where there's a huge. So if there is so much of a issue around these relation aspects and expectation aspects, they need to be addressed institutionally and within the framework of the existing structures, which are already going through some kind of changes. So if our workplace relationship changes and expectations change, then it will ease the pressure. It will ease the pressure from everyone, from performance to become inclusive and accommodative and giving to each other rather than proving oneself, which has been the hallmark of masculinity, that you have to prove always yourself. So if we take out this whole element of how we don't have to prove singularly, then you're beginning to work at every level. And we have always been saying in our work that begin early, begin at an age when you can institute these ideas with open mind. And therefore the adolescents, the pre-adolescent ages, and those are really under stress people. They are, for them, career is at loss. For them, they do not know what the future looks like, and is there only one way to grow? So I think all that needs to be thought in a larger framework, where you begin to question masculine idea of rigid masculinity from a gender relations perspective, and a space where you allow people to discuss and see that we are in a society where equality is truly has to be. It doesn't matter what identity and what preferences and what sexual preferences people have. I think it's much more important is to contribute and live together in respectful manner. So that discourse has to shift institutionally. I'm repeating myself. To be short, very. Thank you.
All right. I think thank you. That I think you got the question right. Anand?
I guess I completely agree with what Ravi shared. I don't have much of contribution. In fact, I would rather want to supplement and by saying that situation in a way has positively become fragile. So in a way, we need to really push hard for the ideas around equality and justice in the time where people have realized that it is feasible, because we have lived for a period of time together, and we have witnessed the crisis in a sense, isn't it? So within the domestic sphere and the messaging around gender justice and role reversals and domestic responsibility of men and whatever, disconnecting it from ideas of masculinities, labor, and feminine labor, etc. So situation is what I basically say that it is positively fragile situation. You just enter and start very thorough work around messaging around gender justice. That possibly might work.
All right, I think that's so before moving on to
just a minute, what I feel is that basically when I say messaging around gender justice, I want to elaborate a little more on that. It is not just about role reversal, but it is basically on injustices. It is about the way we function together as families or as heterosexual, whatever married units. as the division of labor, redefining productive work and reproductive work, because men also got into, so the dichotomy of this productive and reproductive was quite challenged during this period. So some of the very identified areas could be really challenged, which are very much part of the foundation of the patriarchal institution like family. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. I was also thinking that I was also thinking about how this change in the economic situation and affects the spaces that we tend to occupy, and have sort of drastically changed the physical locations, the the interperson difference sort of has shortened inside a family and increased outside the families. And in terms of sort of mental spaces, how I think one part of I mean, and this is from my personal observations, I guess, one part of what employment offers men and perhaps women also is sort of access to male-only spaces, or sort of your homies kind of your in-group kind of spaces. And I think we are sort of seeing that sort of completely break down. And I was wondering if online spaces are sort of supplementing that, or helping with that, and how that. So there is some part of this socialization, this interaction, that is just, there is just no place for it anymore. And I was wondering how that might be impacting expression at home. So the last question that I would like all of you to answer is, and we've got about 6 minutes to do that, is so how are hegemonic masculinities being impacted? Yeah, how are the various forms of hegemonic masculinities, masculinity as described by R.W. Connell, being impacted by the pandemic and its attendant uncertainties? So, maybe Anand, you can start.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, what I feel is that let's decode hegemony as the most dominant and most visible form. If you're dominant and not visible, you don't really make hegemony.
Okay.
You're most visible, but you're not dominant, you don't really make the hegemony. So it has to be most dominant and most visible. What I feel is that during this economic crisis, rather during the lockdown, most of the ideas around hegemonic manhood were not challenged on ground in communities, because they were constantly reinforced on us through media, and even calling the health workers and the service providers as Corona Yodha. So finally, you reinforce the whole idea of Yodha, the warrior. So I don't think we have really challenged the idea of hegemony, and I don't think hegemony is such a kind of brief or narrower idea that can be challenged, because it could be cultural hegemony, it could be a military hegemony. And during the same time, we were talking about the crisis with China, and during the same time, we were talking about the kind of celebrating all kind of those matters. So I don't think it has really challenged the idea of hegemony during this time, So I don't think, and that is why I feel that, hegemony as an idea is most visible, most dominant form. We haven't been able to really challenge during the lockdown. If men have learned rolling chapatis in their homes, they are invisible. I don't know their stories. Most of us, most of the world don't know their stories. So that doesn't really challenge the hegemony. They are rolling their chapatis in their homes, but are not visible. So in that sense, I don't think we have been able to really, it must have really been challenged the idea of hegemonic masculinity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would either of you like to comment? If not,
okay. Quickly, I just wanted to I wanted to say that we have to be, the patriarchy has many ways to invent and reinvent itself. So to believe that hegemony of this form, whatever we mean by hegemony, would just go away is perhaps very ambitious, because we know the boundaries, the tolerance limit of the patriarchy is much higher, much bigger than those who want to change it other way around. So we need to look at newer ways in which uh, the definition of dominance and power and hegemony comes in. But my sense at the same, having said this, I also think that the spaces of hegemony is also shrinking. Is kind of, you see many different spaces. For example, the discussions and discourses on the power relationship has much more intensified within the domestic spaces, much more than ever before. People are really, and the manner in which social media platform and online media has intervened within the family through these family groups, and if you see how those discourses happen, it means the family institutions are impacted in some ways in both directions. Where uh, they feel kind of homogenized, and at the same time highly heterogenized kind of. So we are seeing very paradoxical kind of a trend at this point in time in this transformation. And I'm not using the word transformation always in a positive sense. I think you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back in the manner you begin to relate and redefine relationships. But I think we will do good if we keep a perspective of looking at the diverse ways in which these relations are being questioned, are challenged, are changed, or sustained. And I think that would be important for us to know and keep an eye on
that. Okay, thank you. Raki, if
you need to unmute, yeah.
Yes. Now, I was going to say that unfortunately, toxic masculinity seems to be always finding a way of expressing itself, whether in terms of nationalism or in terms of the caste-linked violence against women, or finding women as scapegoats to blame for the suicide of the otherwise masculine performing Bollywood actors. So I think we are definitely seeing many expressions of toxic masculinity accentuated and amplified by the media during the lockdown.
Okay, thank you. So we'll open the space now for audience questions, and we've already got some questions on chat. You can all add your questions there, and I'll read them out, or if that's okay. So I'm going to start with a question from Abhishek Roy, and the question is: but Anand Pawar, referring to what you said, isn't it also an overt imposition of leading a majoritarian mainstream life, totally withstanding the person's financial capacity and personal choice?
I exactly agree with that. Basically, it is not considering the financial capacities, and I would not just use the financial capacity. I would use class as a term, and class as a kind of quite a kind of term, rather than financial capacities. Because sometimes you might have this financial capacity for a month, and next month you might not really have financial capacity. So that is not the issue. It's all about the caste. So what I feel is that yes, because the aspirations are built by market, and I read this message when I made my comment, and I was referring to market and the internal aspirations of being a man, to match with the neoliberal ideas around being a provider. But provider of what? Not provider of grains, not provider of dal, not provider of chawal, but provider of technology, provider of luxurious life, provider of vehicles, etc. So market already have penetrated the ideas, right? So what I mean here is that yes, it is a majoritarian mainstream life, which is perceived, or rather which is made to be perceived for many of the men, to make it up to the expectations of the market, not even society. मतलब if I could skip for a second in Hindi, because हिंदी में उसका मजा है कि आपकी बदन की खुशबू कैसी आनी चाहिए अब आपके हाथ में नहीं है. You don't have any control over what kind of smell your body should smell in a way. So market is defining that. So that creates the internal desire. When I say internal desire, I also say that those are externally, in a way, impacted. So yes, it is a mainstream majoritarian life, without really sensitively considering the needs of those who are not being able to afford to that. And anecdotally, if I could share, I work in urban slums, and there are urban slum youth who use these duplicate brands of fast track, as a post track. Amul Macho as Amul Macho. Woodland as a woodland. Designed in the same way, spelled in the same font. So the desires are externally created. I'm not saying that desires are just internally created. Internal desires as a provider are also created because of the societal structure, because everyone has these ambitions to grow to the next ladder. Within the caste system, you cannot rise to the next ladder. But within the economic system, you always have this aspiration to go to the next ladder. But the problem is that the next ladder has been defined by market and society and cultures and caste and classes. So that was my that was my expansion of my point about the internal desires. Thank you.
Okay. The next question is from Ankita. We have 20 minutes. We have 18 minutes left. My question is to Mr. Ramakrishnan. Sir, can you shed some light on how the transgender community, especially those who call themselves hijras or kinnars, survived the lockdown, since all their livelihood activities are from the streets, say badai, begging, and sex work? 18 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. Yes, thanks, Ankita, for your question. I think the Hijra and Kinnar subset of the trans communities have been struggling quite a bit. There has been a lot of relief from within the broader LGBT communities, where people have been fundraising, have been trying to mobilize rations, etc. And that support from civil society, and particularly other community groups and collectives, has supported at least 2 or 3 times as much as the government has supported. The Ministry of Social Justice announced a 2-time cash transfer of 1,500 for hijras and kinnars. Now, I think about 10,000 people applied for this across the country. And these were only people who could access an online form and send in their application. And out of that, about 4,000, I think, didn't get selected because they didn't have name and gender matching with their official identity documents, or they didn't have a bank account, etc. But 6,000 people got that government support. But communities and peer mobilization from other segments of the broader LGBTIQ communities have supported. We've also seen that some of the trans community members have been going for sex work, but given the COVID crisis and the state of that market, the sex work market, their ability to negotiate safer sex has been greatly reduced, putting them at further risk of HIV. And there are some folks, especially the folks in their 20s and early 30s, Hijra and Kinnar folks who have access to smartphones, have been able to do a little bit, get a little bit of income through online payments from men who solicit their sexual services completely online, as in, a striptease or things like that. So we've seen some of that happening. But overall, it's been a struggle. And those who stay in the Jamaat system, some of them actually have savings, and the gurus have been supporting them, but it has been quite a bit of struggle because it's like we're in our 7th month, I think, and resources have depleted quite a bit.
Thank you, Ramki. I hope that answered the question. Next question
Anand has his hand raised.
Oh, yeah, Anand.
I just had a question for Ramakrishnan sir. Are there any cases being reported where hijras are not being able to pay to the guru's house, and some kind of domestic violence within the domestic sphere of hijras happened within the lockdown? Because that is also very closely linked with the kind of domestic violence if we expand our idea of domestic beyond heterosexual domestic spheres.
I think there are maybe one or two reports I've heard of violence within the Hijra community, where the gurus were not getting the money that they needed to from the chelas. So that is one thing. But I think we hear a lot more of intimate partner and sexual partner and sexual client related violence also. Yeah,
that is true. That is true. I just wanted to understand. Thank you.
Okay. The next question is to Ravi from Vanita Mukherjee. How do you address the institution of marriage and family then? The more complex and difficult institution to bring about change, as we heard from all of you, especially Ram. So that's, how do you address the institution of marriage and family? 15 minutes.
And can I take the liberty of answering the next question of Shakti, trying to asking about linking migration, reverse migration to the idea of masculinities?
Yeah, sure.
Because, okay.
I mean, you're seeing a connection between the questions. Is that
no?
Did I get that? Okay, but please continue.
It's just that that question got my attention actually. Of course,
sure.
Yes. So, I think it's a. I don't have an evidence-based model to work with institution of marriage within the family. My guess could be as good as anyone else who is concerned about this issue and wants to do something about it. And if there are good ideas, we would definitely like to discuss and take it forward. It's a very complex and difficult institution to work with. But my response to this issue has always been that the one formidable, profound way of working with the institution of marriage is to ensure that girls and women see themselves and everyone see themselves as economic entity. They are, so long as women and girls see and are socialized primarily to get married, we would never be able to change that equation. I think the equation would change only if the girls from a very early age are brought up through the reforms in the school system, livelihood options, all other institutions around, to believe that they are economic resourceful people. They are economically resourceful. They can be economically resourceful. They are economic entity. And that is the only way to change the family institution. I know that there are working families where there are working women, there are conflicts, and men are not. If the men don't change, then it becomes far more a difficult issue for women to carry on. But I think as the time is passing by, the norms regarding women's economic activities, women's education is changing in the favor of changing fundamental institutions within the family, and we must recognize that. And that's the one route. If you only want to engage men and change their ideas of masculinity without changing and without empowering women and girls, on the other hand, it will not go too far. That's my conviction. So it is one. Now, how do you bring about these discourses directly into the family's drawing room? Is through the social media and the digital platforms. I think we need to find creative ways of beaming these messages. Like negative messaging that happens all the time, artificial intelligence. I think we need to create artificial intelligence industry to create this, and that has to be a very defined work that we must all do and to do that. That's one. So my thought and quick reflection on this. On migration, if you give me a 2 minutes time, is it okay? I don't want to take away if somebody else wants
Yes.
to speak, but I just wanted to quickly. Well,
Yeah. So could I just read out the question so that it sets the context for the rest of the audience? So this is asked by Shakti. You have all spoken extensively about precarity and have also commented on domestic and care work. Could you speak a bit more on migration, reverse migration, as a feature of the pandemic and how this relates to masculinities? Over to Ravi. We have 10 minutes left overall.
Yeah. So I know I'll take very brief, and I think others may have important things to say to this, because this is a very important thing that we have witnessed in last 7 months, the migration phenomena. So I just wanted to say that migration is not a monolithic phenomena. It's a very diverse, and one needs to know who is moving for what reasons. We have seen in the past that the migration theorists would say that many men who moved out of the rural to urban areas, they were not all distressed migration. They were not always in need of such of job or other things. They were more aspirant. They had a predisposition to take risk and make lives better. So that's one group of men. Then there are distress migration. People have nothing and they had to move for survival reasons. And then I'm just drawing these two extreme categories to say that they are in between complete range of men who move out of who move from one place to another in search of job, in search of aspirations of lives and other things. So that what happened during pandemic time, we have seen that a lot of these men who moved back, it was a distinct category of men who moved back. It was the most distressed migrant who had moved from urban areas to rural. They were in the most desperate situation that they could not survive in urban areas completely. They were the hardy workers, in fact, largely of them, who were working on daily wages. Anybody who could survive on even for 3 or 4 months of salary of some kind, they stayed back and tried their fortune here. But then, so it is the desperate, distressed, most marginalized, most poor people who moved, and they put their life at stake. They died on the way, and we have all that statistics. How many men died on this, and they were sprayed with disinfectants and all kinds of, how state masculinity came over them to, on one hand, these men felt that they can walk over all these miles, and then there was a state masculinity which was kind of pushing them back with disinfectant, spray, and all that kind of stuff, and locking them down. So my sense is that that's one linked to a very conflict of masculinity ideas that came out of despair from everyone. But those who reverse migration again needs to be seen as to who are all moving back, and by migration experts would say that 20 to 30% people are moving back, and we have to see who are these people who are moving back. Those who have connections, who have resourcefulness in the cities, and those are the first ones to come first. Then come the other layers, and I think that again shows sense of your position in societies, which gives you an advantage, or where does it put you in this? Where are you on that vulnerability spectrum as a man, and how you can cope with that is what defines the movement back and forth in this migration. And I think that's important to know and remember when looking at this whole issue of mobility, rather than monolithizing that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to come in.
Sure.
On the issue of migration. For instance, I was working in Bihar where they would report that those men who have migrated to Mumbai for the job would come back and enjoy more privileges during the Chhat Puja. Because Bombay se aaya hai, the person who has returned from Bombay. So there has always been connection between the kind of being a privileged migrant, back at the source of migration. Okay, and there are many other connections about the kind of post pregnancies and etc. But he would enjoy that a privileged Bombay migrant coming back to Bihar for Chhath Puja. But this time what happened is that, all those migrants returning back to the source were vulnerable migrants, as Ravi said. He didn't use the word vulnerable migrants, but basically it was a kind of changing the relationship. So the idea of manhood, idea of superior manhood, that he would carry a man coming from Bombay to a particular part of Bihar. I'm just using Bihar as an example, okay? I mean, I'm just saying that anyone who is migrating from any metro city to any parts, okay? And then he possibly would enjoy that more privilege of manhood as the provider, coming back to celebrate a kind of cultural stuff. And then this time he was forced to go back as a vulnerable person, maybe vulnerable of Raj Thackeray or vulnerable of whoever, Now, the reverse migration, as Ravi is correctly saying, only those who have basic connections out here, because I live in Pune and I see and I realize that, many of my friends are in a construction business, and they say that, now, for instance, in Pune, I just read the news saying that, the laborers are being, they were provided with the air ticket to fly in Pune because their metro work of Pune Municipal Corporation was restricted. So the metro labor is being provided with the air tickets to travel from Patna to Pune. They came here. So those who have connections, as Ravi said, are coming back. But then the new kind of vulnerability at the destination of the migration is another challenge for these men. Where would they get health services? Bicholia को क्या कहते हैं? Ravi, please help me. Bicholia is what?
The middlemen or the agents who play the major role in moving people. And
exactly. So these middlemen are going to exploit them like anything. So these are going to be possibilities of the migration and migration-related vulnerabilities about men who must have enjoyed all kind of masculine privileges in their source.
Unless you want to use the word trafficker.
Trafficker, who will lose all kind of privileges and will be exposed to vulnerabilities as the destination of the source, destination of the migration. And it's going to be impacting their ideas of manhood. God knows next time they go back and they'll assert more masculinities. Thank you.
Okay, that was very illuminating. So we are, I think there are no more chat questions. I'd like to now sort of summarize and hand over to Dr. Swarna from Pragya. So I think we covered a very wide variety of issues today in the talk, and I'm really grateful for all the panelists and for the questions that came in. We are sort of seeing masculinities and gender relations transform due to an external unrelenting external force, and this transformation is being expressed in ways that are in a lot of situations leading to violence and leading to a reinforcing of certain behavioral and social patterns, and in certain other situations are leading to those patterns being questioned and them having to be reanalyzed and looked at from a fresh point of view. So I think that would be my sort of one-line summary of this extremely rich discussion. And thank you, Ravi, Anand, and Ramki, so much for the discussion. And thank you, Pragya, Dr. Shakti, Swarna, and FES for this opportunity. And over to Swarna.
Thank you so much. I mean, now I'm feeling, we were really stressed about 4 of these webinars. How will we pull it off? And now I'm feeling really sad that the series is over. So we will just have to do this again. Thank you so much for the wonderful discussions today, and in absentia, all the people who've come and spoken before as well. I wanted to speak at the end because I wanted to say thank you to each of you, but also again to FES for urging us to do this. It's very easy during this period to sink into some level of low activity and not push and think what can be done, what are the hard things you can do. And I'm really grateful to Damayanti and Jyoti from FES India for pushing us to do this. Very grateful to Dr. Shakti for taking the initiative to write the concept note and put all the briefings together week after week and remind us about the small things that I inevitably would forget, such as bios. To Puril for logging in at 3:30, hosting the sessions and recording them and editing them and putting the videos up. So it always takes a team, as you know. And I wanted to say thank you to everyone who's made this series happen, to all the people who registered, and showed up, and to all the people who will be watching the videos. These are not events. These are conversation starters. We want to keep talking about these issues. We want to keep working on these issues with all of you, those who've been on the panels and those who've been in the conversation, in the chat, and so on. So don't disappear on us. Let's take this forward in as many creative ways as we can. Thank you again.